Sergeant James Walker had served in the military for 20 years. 2 decades of service to this country were not only a long journey of sacrifice, but also a story of resilience, toughness, and wounds that were not just physical, but also emotional. A soldier who had gone through many battlefields, witnessed losses and suffering, but had never turned back, had never allowed his loyalty to waver. Today, James was not fighting on the battlefield, but he could still feel the tension, the division that was lingering. It was a special day, the day his son Ethan, who had followed in his father's footsteps, was about to graduate and receive his Navy insignia. For James, it was a proud moment, knowing his son would not only continue his legacy, but might even overcome the challenges James had faced, things James could not even put into words. As with many times before, James arrived at the military base early. Cars and trucks were parked around the graduation ceremony area. A crowd had gathered, all waiting for the solemn moment when the brave soldiers would receive their certificates. James stood there, dressed in full military uniform, his face quiet, his gaze distant. He knew this was not going to be an easy day. Although he had spent 20 years in the military, James still felt like an outsider whenever he stood in crowds like this. That feeling was always present in every step he took. Part of him could not fully connect with those around him. The gazes upon him, from the young soldiers to their families, were no longer filled with admiration like they had been in the past. There was a hint of hesitation, suspicion, even avoidance. They didn't speak, but he knew. Since joining the military, James had learned to live with these stares. As a black soldier in a predominantly white force, he had learned to endure whispers behind his back, cold glares and unspoken discrimination. But nothing hurt him more than this feeling, the one where he stood in the very place he had sacrificed so many years, where he had given his all, the place where this country had never fully accepted him as a true part of it. "No one here has been through what I've been through," James often told himself when his white comrades looked at him warily. They knew he was a good soldier, but his skin color meant he was never fully respected. How many times had superiors looked down upon him, silently judging him by his appearance? However, today was not a day to dwell on the past. Today was Ethan's day, his son, whom James had always taught to be stronger, tougher, and to never let himself be judged or misunderstood because of his skin color. Ethan had completed Navy training and was now about to stand on the podium to receive his medal, a proud achievement that no one could take away. His son stepped out from the ranks, dressed in his Navy uniform, his face shining with pride, but also a hint of worry. Ethan was no longer the little boy who once followed his father around, clinging to his legs on every trip. Ethan was now a full-fledged soldier, trained, shaped by the hardships that only Navy personnel could understand. But as he stood under the graduation lights, part of Ethan still felt fear. The difference in skin color had made Ethan feel that same sense of distance. Although unspoken, in the gazes and whispers of the crowd, there was always something amiss. The soldiers around him still exhibited hesitation when interacting with him. It made him feel out of place, even as a soldier, even as someone who had been trained as a true warrior. And then, when the ceremony began, James sat in a corner, unnoticed by anyone. He didn't need to stand out. Today was not about him. But when he looked into his son's eyes, he knew Ethan was there, and that was all that mattered. It was an emotional day, but not just with pride. At that moment, a sense of unease lingered in James's heart. He knew part of him would always be an outsider in this world, but today, he told himself, today is for my son. I can't let those things cloud this moment. The graduation ceremony began solemnly. Rows of seats around the ceremony area were filled with families, friends, and soldiers. Everyone was waiting for the significant moment when the soldiers would complete their training. The crowd buzzed, but there was an uncomfortable air that permeated the space. The lights from the floodlights illuminated the podium, creating a solemn atmosphere. James sat quietly in the back, his eyes never leaving his son. Ethan stood in the ranks, tall in his Navy uniform. His hair was neatly cropped, his face tense yet filled with pride. To James, seeing his son in this uniform made his heart race. However, he couldn't help but feel the coldness, the scrutinizing stares from those around him. As the ceremony started, A voice rang out from the loudspeaker announcing the outstanding achievements of the recruits, followed by each one stepping up to receive their medals. It was a beautiful sight, but James couldn't ignore the difference. Although he was a seasoned sergeant, in these moments, he felt like nothing more than a shadow blending into the crowd. A young female guard approached with a scrutinizing look in her eyes. She held a guest list printed from the security department in her hands. "Sir, I don't see your name on the registered list for today's event," she said, her voice not loud but cold enough to send a chill. James looked up, somewhat surprised. "I'm Sergeant James Walker, father of Ethan Walker. I confirmed the invitation through the system a week ago." "We're just following security protocols, sir," the guard quickly responded. "If you cannot provide either a printed invitation or an electronic invite, please leave the area." A brief moment of discomfort filled the air. James worked to maintain his composure. He understood that this wasn't just about forgetting the paperwork. James raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he had done wrong. He looked up at the soldier, trying to stay calm. His body stiffened, but anger began to rise within him. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. This is my son's graduation. I can't leave," James replied firmly, though still composed. The soldier looked at him with mockery in her eyes. She didn't say another word, but her gaze was clear. She wanted him to leave, not because of security or protocol, but because she didn't want someone like James sitting in this ceremony. A tense moment passed. Everyone around began to pay attention. The coldness of the guard not only made the atmosphere heavier, but also caused all eyes to turn toward James. Some of the soldiers nearby started sighing and exchanging glances, as if they were silently agreeing with the guard's actions. James clenched his fist under the table. The anger and disappointment surged within him, but he tried to remain calm. He looked around and clearly felt that everyone was judging him, not for his achievements or the sacrifices he had made, but simply because of his skin color. It was a feeling like an old wound, aching every day but never healing. Ethan stood not far away. As the crowd continued to whisper and watch, he saw the guard confronting his father. Anger flared up in Ethan's heart. He knew this was not the first time his father had been treated like this. In the past, James had silently endured, but today Ethan could not stand by and watch. Ethan began walking toward his father, but before he could reach him, a voice interrupted. "Please, leave him alone." The voice was low but sharp, coming from behind. 4 SEAL soldiers, Ethan's trainers, stood up from the row behind and moved forward. They didn't say anything further, just looked at the guard with cold yet commanding glares. The entire room immediately fell silent, a tense silence. The guards looked at each other, unsure of what to do. The highest-ranking SEAL in the group spoke, his voice not loud, but powerful enough to command everyone's attention. "Do you really want to do this?" he asked. The guard didn't respond immediately. They stood still, and the crowd around them held its breath, waiting for the decision from the soldiers in power. James felt like a stretched bowstring in that moment, full of worry and anger. A soldier in the crowd whispered to his companion, but James could hear every word. "That damn Marine! Always thinking he's someone special. He can't even let his son's graduation be peaceful." Hearing this, the pain in James grew heavier. He didn't speak. He just silently looked at the guard, his eyes a silent declaration of war. "I'm not someone you can easily dismiss," he thought. His son, Ethan, couldn't stay still. Although he wanted to protect his father, Ethan knew that all eyes were on them now, and only one action could change the situation. With a decisive step, Ethan moved forward, saying nothing, simply standing next to his father. The crowd around them began to murmur, the whispers spreading quickly. "That's Sergeant Walker's son, right?" Someone in the crowd stood up and began to clap, but no one dared to make any more noise. All eyes turned to the commander's reaction. Every gaze in the room was now fixed on James and Ethan. The crowd didn't speak, but the whispers started spreading like a breaking wave. The guard stood there, not intending to back down. She looked at James, her eyes not filled with respect, but with a gaze full of power and malice. "Sergeant Walker," she repeated, her voice still sharp as a blade, "I have asked you to leave immediately. If not, I will have to take stronger measures." James didn't say anything, but inside everything felt like it was boiling over. Her words were like deep cuts to his heart, stirring up all the emotions he had tried to suppress for so many years. He was a soldier, a seasoned sergeant, but now he was being treated like an outsider. Just because of his skin color, a thing he could never change. He had to endure this unwarranted discrimination and contempt. The people around began to pay more attention, but no one dared to speak up. They stood still, seemingly afraid of the confrontation between a black soldier and two white guards. The crowd felt the tension, but no one dared to do anything except watch the unfolding situation. The guard's gaze remained unchanged, still waiting for James's reaction. His mind was spinning, his heart pounding. He tried to keep his anger in check. The words she had just spoken were not the first time James had heard them. Words like this had been all too familiar to him. From the moment he joined the military, he had always been the other. A black soldier in a predominantly white force, he had always felt isolated, cold, and the subject of suspicion from those around him. But today, at his son's ceremony, James could no longer keep quiet. Although he maintained an outward calm, inside his anger was burning. Each word the guard spoke felt like a knife wound to his heart. Why was this happening? That question kept echoing in his mind. Why did he have to endure all this injustice, especially on his son's day? "Sorry, I don't understand. This is my son's graduation. I can't leave," James replied, his voice clear but still composed. The guard didn't relent. She stood there, her hand still on her weapon, her gaze unchanged. A small twisted smile crept across her face. A smile not of mockery, but of arrogance. She didn't see James as someone with the right to speak up, but rather as someone to be looked down upon. "Who do you think you are, speaking like that?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain, as though she was all too used to pushing people like James under her heel. Ethan, James's son, stood silently for a moment, but then, unable to bear it any longer, he stepped closer to his father. "My father is not someone you can easily remove," Ethan said, his voice filled with anger but also firm determination. He was no longer the child who used to cling to his father on every trip. Ethan had grown, trained to face challenges not only from the battlefield, but also from the discriminatory attitudes within the very country his father had dedicated his life to. He looked directly at the guard, his gaze not filled with fear, but with determination. The guard merely snorted, her eyes full of mockery. "Who do you think you are, standing here talking to me?" she challenged, her voice seeming to try to humiliate Ethan in front of everyone. The entire room fell silent. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the next explosion. But then a low, sharp voice from behind broke the tense silence. "Touch him, and you'll pay the price." 4 SEAL soldiers, Ethan's trainers, stood up, stepping forward with the unshakable strength of mountains. One of them, the tallest, turned to face the guard. "Sergeant Walker has more hours of combat than this entire room combined," he said, his voice low yet sharp. "Do you really want to do this?" Everything shifted immediately. The entire crowd fell silent. The guards dared not move. They stood still, and though no words were spoken, everyone could feel the authority emanating from the 4 SEALs. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were warriors from an elite force, people who had witnessed and fought in unimaginable battles. The guard could clearly feel the presence of the SEALs standing there, protecting James. The challenge in their eyes caused her to hesitate for a moment, but then she refused to back down. She turned back to James with a defiant look, as if to say that no matter what happened, she would never yield. "How have we served this country?" James spoke again, his voice sharp as a knife. "What have we fought for, if not for a country that does not have racial discrimination? What is the reason I am treated like an outsider in my own son's graduation ceremony today?" Once again, James's words were like a wound that struck the shared pain of everyone in the room. The guards, though silent, clearly looked uneasy. The crowd around them started murmuring, and some began standing up, gently applauding, not in approval of the compromise, but in acknowledgement of the resilience James was showing. But one soldier in the crowd, a tall man with a hardened face, stood up and looked at the commander. "This cannot go on," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "A soldier like him should not be treated this way." The base commander now stepped forward, looking at James with a thoughtful gaze. "Stop," he commanded, his voice no longer cold but more serious. "The ceremony cannot continue without him." The crowd around them began to clap. Not because of forgiveness from the commander, but because of James's courage and the fairness he had fought for all these years. Everyone could feel that today was not just a small victory for James, but a larger battle, a battle against racism, against the judgment that people of color always faced. The entire room remained silent, as if time had stopped. Only the tension from the stares and the slow steps of those involved in the confrontation lingered. The words of the commander only added to the weight of the moment, but no one dared speak up. No one dared do anything except watch James and those protecting him. James didn't take his eyes off the guard, his hands clenched under the table, anger rising within him, but he maintained his composure. He knew that today the most important thing was for his son's ceremony to continue, but the way he was being treated, like an animal being hunted, made his heart ache. How many times had he tried to forget the discrimination? How many times had he convinced himself that in the military, where everyone served the same country, racism wouldn't exist? But right now, everything was shattering. All the suffering he had endured over the past 20 years felt like a thorn in his heart, impossible to remove. One of the guards, still maintaining her cold attitude, looked at James as though he were a mere lamb. "I told you to leave," she said, her voice full of arrogance. "You don't belong here." Her words weren't just a threat. They were a clear statement that a black man, a Marine, had no right to be present at a ceremony for white soldiers. This was the blatant and ruthless discrimination James had known too well. But this time, it felt like a new wound, cutting deeper into his heart. "Enough," the tallest SEAL said, his voice sharp as it cut through his teeth but still firm, full of strength. "You don't understand. Sergeant Walker has spent 20 years serving this country. He's endured enough. If you want to continue like this, you'll have to face us." His words were like a slap to the guards. They exchanged hesitant glances, as if they no longer dared to continue the confrontation. The four SEALs, with all their strength and prestige, formed a solid wall to protect James. The room no longer felt like a solemn graduation ceremony. It had transformed into a battlefield full of tension and opposition. Ethan stood beside his father, but he felt his body constricting, each heartbeat pounding in his chest. He couldn't stay still while his father was treated this way, yet at the same time, he recognized the gravity of the situation. He had been taught that soldiers, those in power, were always allowed to act as they wished, and sometimes even a small mistake could cost a career, or even a life. But today, Ethan could not look away. He looked at the guard with a gaze that could not hide his anger. "My father fought for this country. He has sacrificed too much, and I won't stand by while you treat him like this," Ethan said, his voice quiet but determined. "If you don't understand that, I'll show you." One person in the crowd shrugged, and then murmurs began to spread. The people around, though they did not dare speak outright, could feel the clear injustice. Some began to stand, clapping gently, not for James's bravery, but because they felt embarrassed by what was happening before their eyes. Meanwhile, the commander, still standing in a corner of the room, quietly stepped forward. He looked at the guards with a stern expression, as though evaluating the entire situation. "Stop," he said, his voice grave and serious, no longer the light tone it had carried earlier. "We can't continue like this." The room fell silent. The crowd seemed to understand that this was no longer just a small conflict between James and the guards, but a larger battle for justice, for the rights of an individual in this society. The guards dared not respond, but their eyes still showed hesitation. One of them, a younger face, appeared slightly fearful. She looked at the commander and then back at James, as if unsure of what to do. The commander slowly approached James, his gaze locked onto his, no longer cold, but filled with regret and remorse. "Sergeant Walker," the commander said, his voice tinged with exhaustion, "I apologize for the inconvenience, but the graduation cannot continue without you. You may stay." The commander's apology did not bring James peace, for he knew this was not real change. It was merely a temporary compromise, a way to calm the situation. But in his heart, the shame could not be erased. He didn't want apologies, didn't want sympathy. He wanted justice, and that seemed too far out of reach. But Ethan, with his deep understanding of the situation, suddenly stepped forward, turning to look at his father. Dad, this graduation isn't just for us to receive our insignias. It's a victory for all of us. The ones who have always had to fight, not just with the enemy, but with the prejudice and injustice too. As Ethan spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath. It was a moment of silence, but also one that opened up the possibility for change. Ethan's courage wasn't just about protecting his father, it was about standing up for what was right, even in the face of threats and pressure from those in power. The whole room began to clap, not because of the commander's apology or the shift in the situation, but because they recognized that justice needed to be protected, no matter the opposition or discrimination. The crowd began to murmur again, their eyes filled with doubt, and the tension spread throughout the room. Every whispered word felt like a knife cutting into James's mind. He stood there, in his worn-out uniform, his posture straight, but his heart swelling with frustration he couldn't suppress. The crowd still whispered, looking at him, but not with the respect he deserved. He was certain they didn't see a seasoned sergeant who had fought for the country. They saw a black soldier. And in their eyes, that was probably still not enough for him to stand on equal footing with the other soldiers. His skin color had always been the excuse they used to give themselves the right to discriminate, to feel that he didn't belong there, didn't belong in this military. "Please, could you leave?" A voice suddenly came from behind, causing James to turn. A young soldier from the crowd, someone unremarkable, stared at him from a distance with an unfriendly look. James was not surprised by these words. He had heard them too many times before, and he had grown used to the sharp glares and the cold dismissals. But this time, the look wasn't coming from strangers. It was from his own comrades, the ones he had fought alongside. Anger began to rise within James, but he suppressed it. Despite this, a heavy sigh escaped him, as though trying to dispel the tense atmosphere. He bowed his head, no longer looking at the young soldier, but instead staring down at the ground, as if the earth could somehow erase the injustice he had endured for so many years. "Is that your answer?" Ethan's voice rang out, filled with fury. Ethan could no longer stand to see anyone insult his father. He knew that what James had endured wasn't just a one-time event, but a series of silent battles his father had fought. Ethan's words struck like a lightning bolt in the gloomy room. Everyone in the room turned, eyes full of curiosity, but also judgment. Ethan stepped forward, his gaze unwavering as he stared at the young soldier. "He is Sergeant James Walker. My father fought for this country for 20 years, and he deserves to be here, more than anyone else," Ethan said, his voice full of resolve. "If you don't understand that, you will have to face us." The atmosphere grew heavier than ever. The people around fell silent, as though they had just heard a declaration of war. Some of the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. Others quietly turned away, seemingly unwilling to get involved, but unable to ignore the truth unfolding before them. But the young soldier, with a look of hatred, had no intention of backing down. "He's the son of a Marine," he sneered, his tone as if he had uncovered some brutal truth. "Those soldiers, they're just the ones pushed out into the battlefield. Isn't the color of his skin a big enough issue? Only people like him have to endure this life." His words were like a heavy slap in James's face, not just because of the crude language, but because of the mockery, the contempt for what James had sacrificed. He not only judged James by his skin color, but denied everything James had done for this country. It was an insult that could not be tolerated. The tension in the room escalated quickly. The soldiers around them began to shift, looking at each other as though they wanted to intervene, but were hesitant due to the growing resistance from Ethan and the Four SEALs. "Shut up!" Ethan shouted, losing all restraint. He had reached his limit, not just because of his father, but for himself, for everything he had witnessed throughout his life. He stepped forward toward the young soldier, just a few paces away. The entire room fell silent, only the sound of Ethan's footsteps echoing through the space. He didn't know exactly what he was doing, but he couldn't let the soldier continue to disrespect his father. He couldn't let anyone trivialize James's sacrifices as if they were meaningless. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. But before Ethan could take another step, a low, cold voice rang out from behind. "Enough!" It was the voice of the SEAL who had been silent all along, observing everything. "He is our father, and no one has the right to disrespect him. The four SEALs stepped forward, forming a solid wall around James and Ethan. Now, it wasn't just a confrontation between James and the young soldier. It was an unspoken battle between values, between the principles of soldiers and racism. This wasn't a battle of weapons. It was a battle for resilience and justice. The harsh words lost all their power. The crowd fell silent, their eyes no longer filled with doubt, no longer full of discrimination. Everything became clearer than ever before. James was not just a black soldier. He was someone fighting for what was right, for justice. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. Everyone stood still, silent, watching the unfolding events. James stood there in the middle of the crowd, a feeling of helplessness rising within him. Although he had dedicated his life to this country, although he had sacrificed countless times in brutal battles, in the end, the people in this room still didn't see him as a soldier deserving of being there. In that moment, when the tension between the guards and the four SEALs reached its peak, James felt a sense of paralysis. He knew that if he didn't do something today, these feelings would consume him, would swallow up the pride he had once had. But perhaps the most painful truth was that there was nothing he could do to change how the people around him saw him. Standing silently beside his father, Ethan felt his father's pain like a wave crashing into his heart. He saw everything his father had endured during those 20 years in the military. He saw the quiet face, the effort to maintain composure. But in James's eyes, Ethan knew that his father was enduring a deep hurt. Though he was the son of a soldier, Ethan had never fully understood the price of silence, the cost of trying to suppress anger every single day. Ethan could no longer stand still. He looked at the guards, his eyes no longer filled with fear, but with anger and determination. A part of him wanted to charge into this confrontation, to protect his father, to prove that racists would not easily impose their injustice on a soldier like his father, a man whose contributions no one could deny. Ethan took a step forward, calm yet determined. His gaze struck like lightning, making the first guard take a step back. Ethan stood facing the soldier, his fists clenched, not out of fear, but from the anger he could no longer suppress. "He is my father," Ethan said, his voice cold as ice, but it hit the hearts of everyone in the room. "My father has spent 20 years serving this military, sacrificing countless times, missing so many holidays, and today he deserves to stand here. No one has the right to remove my father from here." Ethan's words landed like an explosion in the tense space, causing every eye in the room to turn toward him. The room fell completely silent, save for the sound of Ethan's footsteps echoing through the stillness. He wasn't just standing up to defend his father, but also to defend the honor of all black soldiers, those who had fought not only against enemies, but against the prejudices and discrimination within their own ranks. The guard stood still, his eyes wide, unsure of how to respond. Though hesitant, he didn't dare face Ethan directly, someone with the presence and stature he couldn't ignore. Ethan was the son of a soldier who had fought through harsh conditions. He was a soldier himself, yet because of his skin color, he had never been seen as equal to his fellow soldiers. While the crowd remained silent, another soldier in the back, who had been observing from the start, turned to look at the commander. His gaze was filled with uncertainty, as though he understood that things had gone beyond the point of no return. I don't think this should happen during a graduation ceremony," he said softly, his voice trembling, not from fear, but from a deep sense of guilt. Some in the crowd, though not brave enough to speak out, began to change their expressions. They could feel the glaring injustice James and Ethan were facing. A few of them stood, though they didn't clap, their eyes revealing a silent form of support. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a decision. The guards, despite not speaking, exchanged uncertain glances. Then a heavy silence took over as the commander stepped forward, his face no longer cold as it had been earlier. He stopped a step away, looking directly into James and Ethan's eyes. At that moment, the self-assuredness of someone with power was gone, replaced with a recognition of the complexity and truth he was now facing. "All right," the commander finally spoke, his voice softer but still maintaining the seriousness. "We can't continue like this. Sergeant Walker, you may stay." But the forgiveness in his words couldn't erase the wound in James's heart. He didn't need their forgiveness. He needed recognition. Ethan stood beside his father, looking at the crowd, his gaze speaking volumes of what he was feeling. No one could steal the pride of his family. No one could make his father's sacrifices and contributions meaningless. The graduation ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had completely changed. No longer was it the solemn silence of a formal event, but a tense air, as if everyone had come to realize one thing: that racism could no longer persist, that justice needed to be protected. And in that moment, Ethan had become the symbol of a generation that would no longer accept such discrimination. The room was thick with tension. Every second seemed to stretch into eternity. Ethan stood there, his eyes fixed on the guard, but no longer with fear or hesitation. He had stepped out of the shadow of a child and stood tall as a true soldier, defending his father, defending the honor of black soldiers. The silence in the room became heavier, as though everyone was waiting for an explosion. The guards, who had been trying to maintain their authority, began to feel anxious. None of them dared face the four SEALs standing behind James and Ethan. Their presence was like a warning, a signal that any action on the guards' part would lead to a catastrophic confrontation. They realized that this time, they could not simply impose their power without consequences. At that moment, the base commander, who had been standing in the corner observing everything from the beginning, stepped forward into the middle of the room. His gaze was full of tension and concern, as though he realized this situation could no longer proceed like a typical graduation ceremony. He had witnessed everything from a distance, but when things escalated beyond control, he knew he could no longer stand on the sidelines. "Enough!" the commander's voice echoed, and this time, it held no coldness but only resolve. The entire room held its breath, and all eyes were fixed on him. The guards immediately stopped, but they still stood their ground, their eyes filled with defiance and challenge. Yet despite their presence, the commander's intervention was necessary to quench the escalating tension in the room. The commander moved toward James, but his gaze was still devoid of sympathy or any sign of agreement. "Sergeant Walker," the commander spoke, his voice softening but still firm. "I apologize for the inconvenience. I know this is a special day for your son, but what happened here is unacceptable in the military." The commander's words failed to soothe the pain inside James. He looked into the commander's eyes, disappointment heavy in his gaze. This was the leader of the base, the one with the highest authority here, yet instead of recognition, instead of a true apology for the discrimination he had endured, James received a bland sympathy and a half-hearted apology. "I don't need your pity," James said, his voice bitter. "I don't need an apology from anyone. I've spent my life serving this country. But what I've received isn't respect, but disdain. And not just me, but also other black soldiers. Do you think we don't deserve to be here, in the graduation ceremony of my son?" The commander fell silent, unable to respond to James's strength. He couldn't deny that what James was saying was the truth. In the military, despite the soldiers fighting for this country, racism and injustice still existed, silent and hidden, but enough to harm people like James. And when these words were spoken, they weren't just an accusation against a few individuals, but against a system, a society that had long placed racial discrimination above everything else. The commander felt the pressure not just from James, but from the soldiers around, the ones witnessing this injustice. They couldn't ignore it. They couldn't stand by and see their comrades treated this way without doing something. A soft round of applause echoed from the back of the room. The entire room was silent, but then a few people stood up, starting to clap in support of James. These were the soldiers who perhaps hadn't dared to speak out before, but now they couldn't stay silent anymore. It was applause not only for James, but for everything he represented: courage, resilience, and loyalty, regardless of race. But there were also other looks, disapproving ones. Some still couldn't let go of the prejudice they had carried for years. The tension between the comrades lingered, not easily erased. The commander looked at the crowd, realizing that no amount of acknowledgement or forgiveness from him could change the situation easily. "Sergeant Walker," he finally spoke, his voice softer, "I understand that what you've gone through is unacceptable, and I apologize for the shortcomings in handling this situation, but we can't continue the ceremony without you." James looked at the commander, a sense of shame rising within him. This was not the apology he needed, not the respect he deserved. But now the commander had to bow his head, even if that was the only thing that could restore peace in the room. Ethan stood still, his gaze no longer filled with rage but with deep disappointment. He knew that, even with interventions and apologies today, these things couldn't change the fact that racism and injustice still existed in society. But he couldn't let his father continue to endure this. "Dad, we did the right thing," Ethan whispered. James looked at his son, his gaze filled with pride, but also a little sadness. They had done the right thing, but the fight was still far from over, and sometimes the battles could not be fought with bullets. Finally, the graduation ceremony for James's son Ethan began. But despite the solemnity of the event, the atmosphere in the room remained heavy and tense. What should have been a moment of joy and pride was overshadowed by injustice and racism. Though the commander had intervened and calmed the situation, James's heart could not find peace. The feeling of being an outsider still lingered like an unhealed wound, buried deep inside him, a scar he had carried for years. Sitting in the row of seats, James looked at his son. Ethan stood at the podium, receiving his insignia, his eyes shining with a mix of pride and anxiety. He could feel the tension in his father's heart, but he couldn't do anything to erase those complex emotions. This was an important day for Ethan, but also a day for James to face the truth. Despite being a soldier who had devoted his entire life to serving his country, James was still considered different by society just because of the color of his skin. A sense of loneliness welled up within James. He was not a weak man, but this racial discrimination had made him feel like he was always fighting against the system. Every step he took in the military, every mission he carried out, wasn't because he was a soldier, but because he had to always prove he was worthy. Discrimination wasn't just in words. It was an invisible barrier that held him and those like him back from advancing. That was something Ethan couldn't fully grasp. He was from a new generation, one that was beginning to become aware of these larger issues. But it was not always easy to accept. When Ethan received his insignia, the entire room stood and applauded. But amidst the applause, there was still silence in some areas. The guards standing in the back did not clap. They were silent, their eyes filled with contempt, and those around them felt the same. James could distinctly feel this discrimination. The crowd couldn't hide the lack of goodwill they held toward a black soldier like him. The brief nod from the commander couldn't erase the truth that they still saw him as an outsider, a black soldier. Ethan stepped up to the podium, receiving his insignia. Those standing beside him clapped, but Ethan felt the difference. He didn't feel the full honor of the moment because what he and his father faced wasn't respect. It was discrimination. He could feel the injustice in the eyes of the soldiers around him. They looked at him as if he didn't belong there. That feeling was uncomfortable, but Ethan understood that he couldn't change it immediately. When the ceremony ended, James stood up and left his seat, walking toward his son. Ethan turned and looked at his father. Their eyes met, and in that exchange, there was an understanding, a silent empathy that only those who had gone through the same battle could recognize. James approached, and Ethan saw that his father's eyes were no longer filled with resilience, but with exhaustion, disillusionment. Yet he also saw in those eyes an undying fire, the fire of courage, the spirit of a soldier who would never yield. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice trembling, but filled with certainty, "we did the right thing. We stood up." James looked at his son, a small smile forming on his lips. Though he couldn't erase the feeling of disappointment over the discrimination he had endured, he felt proud of Ethan. Ethan had done what James couldn't do when he was young. Ethan hadn't just protected his father, he had stood up for justice, for fairness, for black soldiers in this military. "Right," James replied, his voice steady but resolute. "We stood up, Ethan. But you must remember this fight doesn't end here. Our generation and your generation will have to keep fighting for justice, for a world where everyone, regardless of skin color, can stand on this battlefield without being looked down upon." Ethan looked at his father, and though he didn't say anything more, He understood that the greatest lesson his father had taught him wasn't what he learned on the battlefield, but how to face discrimination and injustice. This was a battle that couldn't be won with weapons. It had to be fought with perseverance and loyalty to the right values. At that moment, even though he had received his insignia and gained recognition from society, Ethan knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He would have to keep fighting, not only for his father, but for all the soldiers who had been overlooked and discriminated against because of their skin color. As James and Ethan left the graduation ceremony, the 4 SEALs stood behind them, like a wall of protection. The crowd remained still, but no one dared look at them. This gaze wasn't just respect for James. It was the realization that no one could diminish the loyalty and justice of real soldiers. No matter the discriminatory words, no matter the racism they faced, they had proven that they would never give up, and that one day justice would prevail.